Hi everyone, my name is Juan Sandoval and welcome to the class. This is an introduction course to Model 1 of Cognitive Type. There is a Model 2 which is still in development, but we're not going to be talking about Model 2 right now. So Model 1 describes a physical phenomenon in the form of body mannerisms, and these are viewed as running parallel to Carl Jung's psychological types, as he called it, and therefore have the potential to independently verify Carl Jung's typology. So today we're going to explore what that parallel looks like. Now, I want to start this series with a few quotes from Carl Jung, just so you get a sense of what his position was on all the material that we're going to be discussing in the rest of these videos. He says here, "Character is the individual form of a human being. Since this form is compounded of body and mind, a general characterology must teach the significance of both physical and psychic features. The enigmatic oneness of the living organism has as its corollary the fact that bodily traits are not merely physical, nor mental traits merely psychic. The continuity of nature knows nothing of these antithetical distinctions which the human intellect is forced to set up as aids for understanding." And so Carl Jung is explaining here that the distinction that we make between body and mind is something that we contrive of our intellect. It's an artificial fabrication. And he says that we do this because we simply cannot fathom the totality of it all in our minds. And so it helps us to think of these things as separate, when in fact no organism in nature separates these two parts. And now he goes on to say more about this here. He says, "The distinction between mind and body is an artificial dichotomy, an act of discrimination based far more on the peculiarities of the intellectual cognition, that is, of humans, us, than of the nature of things. In fact, so intimate is the intermingling of bodily and psychic traits that not only can we draw far-reaching inferences as to the constitution of the psyche from the constitution of the body, but we can also infer from psychic peculiarities the corresponding bodily characteristics." Now, the word I like most in this passage is far-reaching, because, few people would say that there is no connection between mind and body. Few people would say that they're completely separate and there's no connection between the two things. Yet the kind of concessions that we might hear people give is more to the effect of, sure, you can tell a couple things about people's minds from their bodies, but not really too much. But that's not what we hear Carl Jung tell us. Instead, he says that the intermingling of body and mind is so intimate that we can say an incredible amount about the mind based on the body, and vice versa. So that's one part of the position that Carl Jung had as far as how he viewed the body when it comes to studying mind and body together. But I actually want to share a few more quotes, if I may, before we get started with the class. And so here's another one following from the same passage. "The psyche is still a foreign, almost unexplored country of which we have only indirect knowledge. It is mediated by conscious functions that are subject to almost endless possibilities of deception." So here, Carl Jung seems to be lamenting the incompleteness of our knowledge of the human mind, which he did a lot if you're familiar with his work. So we are experts at lying to ourselves, and this is despite the fact that, we are one of the best windows into ourselves. And so the irony here is that you might want to argue, well, we're the best source we have for what's going on in our minds, and yet it's a very bad source. And so there's a problem here. How could you do better, right? We are prone to self-deception, and yet we act as though we are the authority of ourselves, and yet we know from research on cognitive biases that we are not the best authority of ourselves. We trick ourselves all the time. So Carl Jung is absolutely right here that we are prone to endless possibilities of self-deception, which brings up the question of how do we gain any true knowledge about who we are? Now, the reason I'm reading this passage to you is because following up on this, he actually provides a solution. He says here, "It appears safe for us to proceed from the outer world inward, from the known into the unknown, from the body to the mind. There are any number of paths leading from without inward, from the physical to the psychic, and it is necessary that research should follow this direction until certain elementary facts are established with sufficient certainty." And there are several statements surrounding this passage, and I encourage anybody to read the full version, which you can find in Modern Man in Search of His Soul, or in the back of certain copies of Psychological Types as well. But in a nutshell, Carl Jung understood that we have a far better handle on the physical, on the known, and that we could more easily explore the unknown, explore elements of the mind that are still unknown from a starting place of the body. So an outside inward exploration process, outside inward research process. He saw this was possible because he understood the intimate connection and the interdependency between the two, with the mind and the body. It wouldn't make sense to explore the outer to get a sense of what's the inner if the two were not intertwined in a very deep and strong way. And this is the essential philosophy behind a Vultologist. So a Vultologist is someone who studies the mind systemically through an equally systemic examination of body expressions. So many people don't realize that Vultology is not at all at odds with Jung's philosophy, his core philosophy, but it is in fact the natural outgrowth of Carl Jung's philosophy. It is what he would have loved to see if he had lived in a different age with more technology, where that sort of thought could be explored, where the tools would be available to do something, for example, like a mass analysis of thousands of videos through video footage, which can be synthesized to understand what the correlations are between mind and body. That can be done now. He understood that was possible, but he just didn't get to it at his time. Video footage was not very common, so it wasn't like he had this available resource, this archive of physical footage that he could go through to figure out these patterns. Psychology was so young in the 1920s, about the time that Carl Jung wrote this book, that even the elementary facts of the psyche hadn't been established yet, according to Carl Jung. And sadly, I still think that remains the case today. And I think that's something that can be remedied if the initial proposal that Carl Jung put forward as to how to study the mind is actually followed through properly. Now that we have some new technology, now that we can actually investigate from the outer inward more systemically than we could in his time, and then we may actually be able to establish some of those fundamental elementary facts of the mind through the body's connection. And so let's focus on establishing those elementary facts of the mind-body connection. We're going to try to find what those are, starting from simple first principles. So the title of this lecture is called Introversion and Extroversion. For those of you who are familiar with the history of those terms, you'll know that they were coined about 100 years ago by none other than Carl Jung. And now they're one of the most pervasive, if not the most pervasive, typological distinction out there. Almost everybody has some idea of what it means or have heard of some variation of what they think it means. But since the time of the introduction of these terms into the modern culture by Carl Jung in the 1900s, they've accumulated various and diverse definitions. And unfortunately, it would take an entire other lecture series just to explain the bifurcations and the historical evolution of Jungian typology since the time of Carl Jung to the present day. But for this lecture series, we're chiefly going to be focusing on Model 1's interpretations of introversion and extroversion, and we'll leave aside the definitions of other systems, and then we'll address them at the end of this video. And so, of the many things that Carl Jung said about introversion and extroversion, I wish to start with these here on screen. I think these phrases here cut at the heart of it all, and they're important because it's the focal point, it's the seed from which other more anecdotal behaviors become tacked on as secondary or tertiary effects of that core. And so it says here, extroversion is an outward movement of interest towards the object. The object works like a magnet upon the tendencies of the subject. And in another passage, he says that the earliest sign of extroversion in a child is his quick adaptation to the environment and an extraordinary attention that he gives to objects, and especially to the effects he has on them. So what we're saying here is that in extroversion, there's a movement of the self towards something as if it's pulling you in magnetically, and there's an attentiveness to the object. We'll talk more about what the object means in a bit here, but for now, we'll say that there's an influence from the object onto the subject, and the subject seems to move towards that object. Now, let's read the other side of this, which is introversion. Here we read that introversion is movement of interest away from the object to the subject. It looks, as one might say, as though all life energy were ultimately seeking the subject. The introvert is not so forthcoming. He is as though in a continual retreat before the object. He holds aloof from external happenings. So now on this side of things, we have a situation where a person is in a perpetual withdrawal, a shrinking away, a removal, a distancing from the object, and seeking the subject, seeking the self. Now, I want you to notice here that already in Jung's own definitions, there is an implicit reliance on the empirical facts of the individual and what they're doing. He may not state it that way, but that is essentially how it plays out in any meaningful sense. How do you know if a child is experiencing a magnetic attraction to the object? Well, you literally see him or her chasing or going after the object. Or what about their attention? Well, you literally see their attention through their eyes fixating on the object and going towards it. So there's this kind of empirical evidence to what he's saying here. This is the definitions that he's giving here for extroversion and introversion are concrete. They're physical definitions. And this is what it means in a practical sense to witness extroversion and introversion. So Carl Jung understood type to be an objective fact of personhood, but he did not systematize what he observed in any quantitative sense. And that was unfortunate, but that's okay because that's what we're here to do today. We're going to do that job for him. So this is a famous statue. The original is located in Paris, but it has multiple copies that have been distributed around the world. And it's very iconic. You've probably seen it already. This statue is variously called names like the poet, the thinker, or sometimes the philosopher. And it's seen as a very universal symbol of deep inner thought or contemplation. So let's say that if you saw this man and were asked, which of these two terms, introversion or extroversion, the ones that we just looked at, placed here on the left and right, which of these terms best applies to him? Most likely introversion, right? Why? Well, because we can physically see his retreat from the object. The hand drawn inward, the downward gaze, the disconnect from the outer world, these are all physically embodied by this statue. And these things matter because it's a statue. Statues communicate meaning through their form. And so the statue itself, of course, has no interiority, but it's communicating by its posture. Literally, it's a symbol of something that matters to us, something that we understand. So because it's a statue, it matters that the hand is brought here. It matters that he's looking down. It matters to the message which the statue gives off, which again is the thinker, the poet, the philosopher. There is an association here that is not just a contemporary one. It's not just limited to the contemporary idea. It's something that we know and understand from observing people. This is a long-standing symbol. So I wanted to start with this statue because sometimes we're not conscious of what we know. We have a lot of unconscious awareness. And what I want to do is bring that into consciousness so that we can move forward from there. And so this is something we already understand, but just not in a quantitative sense. And we need to move into that quantification. So, okay, what about these two individuals? So here, instead of a statue, we have real people. And there is, like in the statue, again, a magnetic retreat from the object towards the subject. You can notice the hands are folded together. Their gazes are disconnected from the environment and going downward. They're keeping themselves aloof from their surroundings. Remember, that's exactly what Carl Jung said about introversion. And so this is an expression of that very thing that he's talking about. It's probably moments like this that the statue is based on. So the meaning of this posture here with these two individuals is very intuitive to most people. So when you see a person like this, you might go up to them and ask, what's on your mind? Because you understand through their Vultology that they're engaged in internal processing and that they are removed from the external world. Like, literally, their attention is gone from the external world. And we can quantitatively say that by the eyes not being engaged. So they are leaving behind the external world for an internal space. Alrighty, now here we see the opposite. We see an engagement with the object in this case being the interviewer, which is cut off screen in this case, but we know that they're there. They're, maintaining connection through eye contact, through gesticulation, through the voice. There's multiple ways of connecting, not just through the eyes, but they're attentive and animated. and their bodies are in a state of constant motion rather than ceasing motion or reserving energy as we saw with the other two samples. But so let's return again to the matter of establishing elementary facts. So we need to codify this knowledge and bring it into the quantitative realm, which is what Carl Jung did not do, and which is why his theories have not progressed as much as they could in the last 100 years. So how do we do that? Well, we give precise physical definitions to what we're talking about. So here's how I'd like to quantify it using basically 4 distinct features. The first is the eyes engaged with the environment. So as Carl Jung said, the little boy, he chases after objects and he pays attention to them. You can tell that he pays attention by the fact that he's actually engaged with them. So eyes engaged with the environment is a symptom of extroversion. Arms expanding into the environment. That's the fact that the little boy has to actually reach for and connect with the object. So having a magnetic attraction to the object would require extending out your extremities towards it. So arms extending into the environment is also a quantified way of expressing what extroversion is. Number 3 is continual articulation. Sound is another way in which we interact with the environment, with other people. So projecting our voice is another way in which we interact with our immediate space around us. And number 4 is taking up more space with the body. So that refers to allowing your body to enter the space that you're in and to expand into the space that you occupy. And likewise, to give you 4 distinct signals of the opposite, number 1 here for introversion, you have eyes disengaged downward or zoned out. If a person's eyes are unable to see the environment because they are in fact closed or diverted, then they cannot be said to be connected to the environment. They cannot be said to be engaged with the environment, like literally speaking. Secondly, arms retreating towards the chest. So if the hands are retreated from the environment and kept away from the world, we cannot say that they are engaged with the world. And so this is very tautological, right? If you're not going to try to reach for them, if you're going to try to keep yourself aloof, as we say, then that literally speaking, physically speaking, that translates to a retreat of the limbs away from the objective world, and that would be number 2. And number 3, to parallel the extroverted one, would be sparse or no articulation. So if articulation is a form of connecting with the environment, then not articulating, reserving your speech is a way of disengaging from the environment and therefore focusing your attentions on the subject rather than the object. And number 4, of course, is taking up a smaller space with the body. So again, if you're expanding comfortably in the environment and you're playing around in the space and you're comfortable moving in it, that's extroversion. If you're not, if you try to make yourself sparse, not just in voice, but also in the space that you occupy, because you're in some polemic against the external world, then that is introversion. So that's number 4. So now here we have 4 and 4 physical, quantitative signals we can use to define precisely what it means to be introverted or extroverted. Now, in terms of their manifest effects, the physical definitions that I just gave for extroversion can be called proactivity or proactive. It's characterized by proactive motion. So cognitively, when there's extroversion, physically there's proactivity. And you read the proactivity of the body to tell that extroversion is happening cognitively. So that's the relationship the 2 terms have to each other. Now, inversely, for introversion, the signals that we just saw, we would call those reactivity or reacting, as opposed to acting, which means holding back and waiting before giving a response. And so here we have a very solid empirical foundation from which to form definitions. And this is what gives us the capacity to establish some of those elementary facts of the mind and body. These 2 tautologies act as a baseline from which we can then continue to build more complex definitions. So let me just give you an example of how this plays out. So let's imagine a person who spends 90% of their time looking like what we see here in this photo. And let's say that they wanted to say of themselves, I'm an extrovert. I'm constantly engaged with the environment. I'm a very engaged person. We could categorically call this into question because according to the definitions of introversion and extroversion that we just established, we can see that this is not the case. So this allows us to counteract what would just be subjective reporting with an empirical definition. And you can say By this definition, no, you're not extroverted because we can see that you're not extroverting. According to what we mean by that, if we consider that synonymous with proactivity, as we discussed, you're not extroverting as your default modus operandi. Likewise, if we come across somebody who 90% of the time they evidence this physicality here, this Vultology, with this animate engagement with the eyes and the hands and the voice, but they wanted to say of themselves, I'm an introvert, by which they mean I'm constantly disengaged from the environment, I'm a very removed person, we could categorically call this into question as well, because we can see that this is not the case. And so we can measure the proportions of these two expressions in a person, and we can see which one of these two modes is more heavily weighed in a person's Vultology. And now this is incredibly valuable because it gives us another window of information outside of the subjective account of the patient. So this is not just meant as a replacement for the patient's subjective account of themselves. It's not my intent to suggest that we eliminate patient information or subjective account or psychological information. But this visual reading is meant as a complement to it, as a kind of external checkpoint against the subjective testimony of the person, due to the fact that, as we mentioned, we are prone to endless possibilities of deception and we struggle to see ourselves objectively. And so what I want to propose is essentially this. Psychological insight plus Vultological insight is greater than psychological insight alone. So when we take the body into consideration along with the mind, we are better off than if we had just taken the mind into consideration and neglected the body altogether. And that is the key takeaway here. You want to add more value, add more insight. It's not about replacing psychoanalysis, but it's about adding another instrument, another tool in the toolbox of the analyst, of the psychologist, in order to augment their capacity to do a good job in evaluating their patients or in evaluating other people in general. All right, now the second part of this video I want to dedicate to the practical application of these principles on the ground in a therapeutic setting. How does the therapist do it properly, and what is proper Vultological practice? And to answer that question, I want to begin again with Carl Jung, but this time a new quote, which is also from Psychological Types. So he says here that every human being possesses both mechanisms, that is, extroversion and introversion, as an expression of his natural life rhythm. A rhythm which Goethe, surely not by chance, described physiologically in terms of the heart's rhythm. A rhythmic alteration of both forms of psychic activity would perhaps correspond to the normal course of life, but other circumstances and inner disposition frequently favor one mechanism and restrict or hinder the other. One mechanism will naturally predominate, and if this condition becomes in any way chronic, a type will be produced. So what Carl Jung is saying here is that introversion and extroversion oscillate with each other like the heart's rhythm of blood going out to the extremities, systolic, and back into the heart, diastolic. And there's a kind of necessity for both of them. It's part of the natural life rhythm of people to oscillate between the two. However, when it comes to introversion and extroversion, the balance between these two poles is frequently skewed in one direction, which we're going to see in the following video. So here we have a video of an introvert, and this is one of our generous volunteers. This clip is 20 seconds long. Now, what you see here on the top right corner is a little flashcard that shows whether or not the girl is introverting or extroverting at a particular moment. So pay attention to that flashcard at the top. And here, I'm going to play the video.
Conspiracy theory. I'm not sure that I'm the type to believe in conspiracy theories. Because I can see how people can get sucked into the idea.
Okay, now I'm going to play it one more time, and this time I want you to pay attention to the little blue circles at the bottom, which represent the eyes, and pay attention to how those two circles, or the eyes, either drop downward or come up and engage with the audience.
Conspiracy theory. I'm not sure that I'm the type to believe in conspiracy theories. Because Because I can see how people can get sucked into the idea.
So as you saw, the girl was alternating between going into herself with a downcast gaze and then coming outward and connecting with the audience. When she's asked to think about a conspiracy theory she thinks is real, which was the prompt for this clip, she momentarily goes into herself to reflect on what her answer is. And in that particular moment, she is introverting. She is not present in the external world during that time. But then as soon as she finds her answer, she comes back around to the audience and then connects with us, which is active extroversion or proactivity. But this activity is not entirely symmetrical. So for instance, with this girl, in total, what we saw was 17 seconds of introversion and 3 seconds of extroversion within a 20-second clip. So this girl was oscillating between coming outward and then going into herself, but the ratio was heavily skewed in the direction of her retreating into herself. So in this isolated clip, we can say that the girl displayed a habitual and predominant display of introversion. And that's something valid that we can say, given the definitions we've given in this video. And now let's take the opposite case. I'm going to play this new video now. So here we go.
Like someone, I was meeting someone, they were like, hi, I'm so-and-so. I was like, hi, I'm Dakota. And they were like, yeah, I know. And it's like, okay, well, I can't lose the fact that I still need to introduce myself to people, even though they might already know my name or who I am, you know, because I'm still just a person and I want to be able to say, hi, I'm Dakota. Oh yeah, I guess you already do know my name, but I'm still going to say it anyway.
All right, so in this clip, we also saw an oscillation between extroversion and introversion, but the ratio of extroversion to introversion was 17 seconds of extroversion and 3 seconds of introversion. So in this isolated clip, we can say that the girl had a habitual and predominant display of extroversion. And so here I've put the two videos next to each other with their introversion to extroversion ratios below them, represented here as 17 to 3 versus 3 to 17. And this would be seconds. So in this example, I'm using seconds as the metric, although there are other ways, which we'll talk about, instead of just seconds spent in each modality, but we're using this method as an introduction. So having done this, can we call it a day and say that the girl on the left is introverted and the girl on the right is extroverted? Well, probably, but we can make sure and gather a bit more data. If we watched another 20 seconds of each individual, we would hope to find that this 17 to 3 ratio would be repeated again, but we may not, because it's certainly possible for an extrovert to have a 20-second time frame in which they're introverting, even if on the whole they have a different expressive pattern that is more characteristic of them. Likewise, it's also possible for an introvert to animate for 20 seconds straight. But if we did this tally second by second for 20 minutes rather than 20 seconds, which by the way is over 1,000 data points, the ratio may start to look something like this. So what we see here is something like 913 to 287 for the left side girl in terms of introversion to extroversion. And for the right side girl, you have a ratio of introversion 225 to extroversion 945. And it's at this point that we start to have a solid idea of what the ratios are. And we can expect the ratios to be relatively unchanging after that. You know, people sometimes ask me, well, isn't body expression variable? Doesn't it change moment to moment? And yes, it is variable moment to moment due to the oscillations that we just described, but it is unvarying at the larger scale. At the largest scale, the data forms very consistent clusters. Our body expressions follow the same principle behind this diagram here, which is a probability distribution graph. And in this case, the graph shows the probability distribution of getting heads in a coin flip. And those familiar with this diagram will know that in principle, a balanced coin will come up heads at a ratio of 50-50. But if you only do around 10 coin flips, then by sheer chance, you might get 7 heads and 3 tails, which would seem to violate the 50-50 clause. But this is because the number of data points is too low. So if instead of doing 10 coin flips, you did 1,000 or even 1 million coin flips, the ratio will always come back to 50-50. And so it's the same with people's Vultologies. If you watch only 20 seconds, then that's like doing 10 coin flips. You might not get the full picture, but the longer you watch, the more stable the ratios become, until you finally approach an absolute ratio that is completely unchanging. Every person on this planet has an absolute ratio of introversion to extroversion that they display, whether or not that value is known to them. So for example, if you had a person walking around recording you 24/7 for years at a time, and then you took all that footage and averaged it out, you would get a fixed ratio of how much introversion versus how much extroversion you display. But of course, it's impractical to walk around recording this much data, and nobody walks around being recorded all the time. So this absolute ratio is not something known to us, even though we all have an absolute value that we display. But the job of a vultologist is to decide on what is the minimum acceptable time needed in order to accurately approximate this absolute ratio. I personally hold to the rule of thumb that 2 10-minute long videos taken at separate times and apart from each other, when put back together, can give you around 90% accuracy in determining people's baseline Vultology as it would appear in another hour or day or week later. So how people appear within a span of 20 minutes is roughly 90% accurate in predicting how they would be in a day or in a week or in a month. You can get closer to 100% accuracy if you invest more time, but 20 minutes is a reasonable minimum of time, and that fits into the time frame of a therapeutic practice. And so what you see in this diagram is the diminishing returns in accuracy that come from readings after a certain amount of time. So you get the most upside in the first few minutes of analysis, and there's the most probability of error in that time frame. But then at around 20 minutes, you're pretty good as far as knowing what's going on. So we don't want to get to the diminishing returns, but we also don't want to have too few data points that we make a lot of errors. And so that sweet spot, in my opinion, is around 20 minutes of footage. And so what I might suggest practitioners and therapists to do is inform your patients that you do vultological analysis and ask if they'd like to have one. If so, you can set up a tripod with a camera as you guys talk it out, and then you can turn it off after around 20 minutes. Don't try to type them as you're recording them. That's not a good idea because you need to put aside some time to review the video and to do the checking and tally up the ratio of signals in order to get a proper result. So what I would suggest is letting the meeting go on, and then after the meeting is over, you can take 20 minutes or so to do the visual analysis using our online tool, which helps you put in the data and exports out a report for you with the results that they have. And then you could talk about those results with them in the next meeting. Which brings me to the final part of this talk, and that is discussing the results with the patient. Now, it's easier to talk about results which align with the patient's self-understanding. And so we're just going to skip that one altogether, and we're going to focus on the misalignments. So earlier I gave an example of 2 individuals who labeled themselves as introvert and extrovert, yet according to the elementary facts of the body-mind connection that we established, they had themselves typed backwards. Yet, as I mentioned earlier, we cannot leave out the subjective factor, the subjective opinion of the patient. We should never simply dismiss their subjective account. Instead, a therapist would do well to ask the patient to expand upon what they mean by introversion and extroversion. And in my experience, there are 3 general things you might discover. The first thing that it might be is that they understood the physical criteria being used for introversion and extroversion, but they have a misperception about their own degree of engagement or disengagement with life. In these cases, they may not have noticed prior to this how much they are engaged or how little they are engaged with objects. And the video analysis can illuminate them about this fact of themselves. They may have thought about themselves that they were very sedentary, but then a visual analysis demonstrates that they are rather restless, for example. Or perhaps they don't have a good reference frame. Maybe the patient is using their mother or father as a reference point and then seeing themselves as disengaged relative to, let's say, their mother, who is maybe manically engaged. So relative to their mother, the patient feels removed and withdrawn. But relative to, let's say, 1,000 people in the general population, they would fall on the engaged side of the spectrum. It's just that they would fall behind the mother, who is maybe at a higher percentile in that population. By the way, as a side note, we have a database freely available at Vultology.com, which carries hundreds of label samples, which can serve as a reference for where a person might fit along this spectrum. But going back to this, so it's very common that we measure ourselves relative to our immediate family members. And it's often the case that there's an ego image attached to the patient, which acts as a counterpoint to the parents. So for example, if a child has a parent who embarrasses them in public, often because of how loud and animate and pushy they are, over here on the top percentile of extroversion, the child may create an ego differentiation and say, I'm not like my mom. My mom is all over the place. She's an extrovert. I'm an introvert. And in that case, that category of extroversion and introversion is instrumental to the patient as a means to create a division between their ego and that of other people, especially family members. They've found a linguistic dichotomy to help them explain something about their personal world, and this ego differentiation is actually important as a first step in the development of a person in order to emancipate them from their parents. So we don't want to undermine that. We don't want to tell that specific patient that you're wrong about being an introvert, because what that translates to in their mind is, your ego is flawed, your self-understanding is an illusion. And this causes damage to the ego, which leads to instability, which leads to more harm than good. So instead, what we simply want to do is show the patient that, yes, relative to your mother or father, you are more introverted, and that needs to be acknowledged. You're not wrong about that, but it's just that relative to the whole human population, you still fall on this side of the line, and that's something that's much better accepted, and that's something that integrates with what they've already been trying to use the category for in their personal lives. And so in that case, it actually adds to the patient's self-knowledge. It complements it rather than subtracting from it. All right, so that was number one possibility, is that they have a misperception about themselves and how to address that. The second possibility is also very common, and that's that they're applying a different definition of introversion or extroversion that they've heard somewhere along the way in their personal journey. And they're using that definition of themselves and identifying relative to that definition. So for example, let's say that they are not a good social mixer. They don't like to be in parties, and somewhere along the line in their life journey, someone told them that an extrovert is someone who likes parties and is a good social mixer. And understandably, they don't identify with that because that's not who they are. So once again, here the ego has correctly drawn a boundary around itself, and that boundary is not wrong according to the category that they've created. They don't fit that category in their mind. And so there's no need to question that boundary for what it means in its own terms. And yet, in the case of an extrovert here, the physical fact remains that this person is still highly engaged with the external world. But it just happens not to be the world of people. Extroversion, by our definition, is not just about a magnetic pull towards people, but it's about a pull towards objects in general. And people are a special case of an object, but not the only one. Other forms of engagement with the external world might be canoeing or biking, dancing, singing. Socialization is just one subcategory of extroversion. And I would call this social extroversion. And so, in the world of people, you will find extroverts with social anxiety, for example. They'll be the sorts of people that love going outdoors, they love engaging with life and the environment, they like to play, they like jumping, they like hiking, they like doing things. But when it comes to people, perhaps they become stressed easily or anxious easily. And there's all sorts of reasons for why a person might have social anxiety, ranging from bad past experiences and trauma, to insecurities about themselves, to hormonal imbalances. Now, some typologies define introversion as what is essentially another name for social anxiety. But we don't believe this is wise or true. So it's important to keep in mind that in Model 1, social anxiety and not being good with people is not the same thing as introversion. Why is that distinction important? Well, from a therapeutic perspective, it's very important to distinguish between native introversion and social anxiety, just like it's important for any medical expert to distinguish between two different diagnoses. And not doing so can lead a patient to have false information about themselves, and that false information can be misapplied in their life. So, for example, if a person with social anxiety is told, that's okay, it's because you're an introvert and that's just who you are, this is not only misleading them, but it's actually reinforcing them by giving them a rationalization. So if the patient feels like their social anxiety is just something innate about them because they're introverted, then there's some fatalism attached to that. There's nothing that can be done because it's seen as an innate part of their personhood. But Perhaps deep down they'd like to engage with the world to the degree that is natural for their innate psychology. But if they think that their innate psychology is introverted, then they will not break free from that and go into their real native state, because they think that this is their native state. And that can be very problematic to the patient. So it's important to get this right and to not mislead other people, which leads me to the final possibility of the three, and that would be practitioner error. We as practitioners or therapists can misread the signals, or the Vultology instrument itself may be misrepresenting a person's psychology. And Vultology is a skill like any other. There are degrees of competence. A well-trained Vultologist will be able to identify a type correctly the majority of the time, but the error rate is never zero. So just like with any medical test you might take, there may be errors in the instrumentation, and there's limits to the instrumentation of Vultology. So the therapist should keep this possibility in mind at all times, and to not assert their own analysis on the patient unanimously, but instead start a dialogue with them about the Vultological results, and then come to a reconciliation with them about what their body is saying and what their subjective experience of themselves is. Find the middle ground that makes sense of both data points, and talking about that mismatch, if there is one, may be a portal into a deeper understanding of the patient's psychology. It may open up a door into something you didn't know about them or something they didn't know about themselves, and that can be very refreshing. So in this sense, Vultology becomes another tool in the toolbox of a therapist to better equip them to understand their patients. But as always, a therapist must apply their own listening ear and listen to the patient and do the difficult task of balancing all the information that they get from them into a cohesive, complete analysis of the person. Hey, for those of you watching this video as part of a lecture course, you can click on the link in the description where you can test your skills to see how well you understood the differences between introversion and extroversion from this video. All right, I'll see you guys around.